What do you want to see more of in your community and in the country as a whole that you're not seeing enough of right now?
I would definitely like to see a more balanced narrative in the media. I think that especially because that has such a huge, tremendous impact on public perception. As you had mentioned earlier, of course, groups like ISIS and Boko Haram and terrorists, they're engaged in horrific attacks all across the world. And unfortunately, whenever they do perpetrate attacks, that's what we see in the media. The global headlines catch on to that, and there's a vicious, repetitive news cycle that impacts the psyche of the general public when they watch these kind of headlines on television and listen to it on the radio. There are other groups who are non-Muslim groups who are committing acts of atrocities against Muslim groups as well, but we never hear about that. In Uganda, the Lord's Resistance Army has been persecuting Muslims for many, many years. In Burma, the Rohingya Muslims have been persecuted for many, many years, but we'll never hear about that on the news. I think it's important to have a very balanced narrative and to allow the mainstream American Muslims to shape and form their own narrative. And part of that means exactly what we're doing now, elevating the voices of the moderate majority to stamp out the rhetoric that the extremist groups like ISIS and Boko Haram attempt to convey through their propaganda.
Charlie Wolf, we talked there about... Yeah, go ahead, Charlie Wolf.
Just briefly, and just in regards to what Zainab was saying, news is local. So the reason you generally would not hear stories of the different groups she mentioned in these other countries is it doesn't have necessarily an effect on the American population. Unfortunately, the ISILs of the world, though they're not operating necessarily in the United States, they are inspiring people in the United States, or trying to inspire people in the United States, and they do call for jihad in the United States. So that's why a news editor would find that story interesting and not necessarily talk about the other ones, unless maybe you were talking about NPR or an international station such as here on Al Jazeera.
What about the...
Which is a very important point.
Yeah, go ahead, Zainab.
Which is a very important point, and to that I would also say not that it justifies the actions that they're engaged in or that they're involved in, that these groups are involved in, but I think it's important for us to also analyze our own policies. What is it on our end that's creating this kind of vitriolic attitude towards Americans and towards the West? Unfortunately, our government has been engaged in controversial acts, and our policies have impacted negatively, predominantly on the Muslim world, post 9/11, after the advent of the war on terror. And human rights abuses that have occurred at prisons like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay facility, where prisoners have been tortured. I think in drone strikes in places like Yemen and Pakistan, not that this justifies.
Yeah, I was going to say, with respect, and I appreciate your saying it doesn't justify, but I think that's a bit of a moral relativism. There is a real threat, unfortunately, in the United States. It's a bona fide threat from terrorism, and unfortunately by Muslim groups, Muslim extremists. And I think the quote originally from the editor of Al Arabiya years ago, just after 9/11, was that not all Muslims are terrorists, but unfortunately all terrorists, the majority of, are Muslim, and that's the position we're in, and it's unfortunate, and I don't want to see harm come to my Muslim friends or the Muslim community in the United States, but we have to fight this thing honestly and understand it for what it is. Now, it doesn't mean I want to see harm befall you or anybody else.
I would challenge that statement with all due respect. With all due respect, I would challenge that statement that most terrorists are Muslims. I think we should really define the word terrorist and have a discussion, have an open discussion about what that word connotates. I mean, I would very well say that Mr. Hicks is also a terrorist. Anybody who has the capacity to shoot anybody over, whether it's a parking spot or whether it's a more important issue or more significant matter, anybody who's capable of committing that kind of crime, I would say that they too are a terrorist. Yet in the media